Welcome to the first lecture of the Shakti Traditions online lecture series. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Alexis Sanderson, Fellow of All Souls and Senior Fellow at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, and until 2015, the Spalding Professor of Eastern Religions and Ethics here in Oxford. He has contributed to the great flourishing of tantric studies and indeed revolutionized the field and our understanding of Shaivism and the tantric traditions through such groundbreaking works as his mapping of the tantric traditions in the world's religions in 1988 and his magisterial work, The Shaiva Age, in 2009, introducing a new periodization of the history of religions in South Asia. And this includes groundbreaking work on Shakti traditions. So without further ado, I will leave the word to you, Professor Sanderson.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. This is an unusual experience for me. I've never lectured to a computer screen before, but I hope, adjust to it. I've agreed to give a lecture on the Shakti traditions of Kashmir. That is to say, of those traditions among the Shaivas of Kashmir that privilege the goddess as the ultimate object of worship and meditation. Sometimes their rhetoric is such that one might imagine that they abandon the appearance of being Shaivas and are Shaktas in some stronger sense, that is to say, worshippers of the goddess alone to the exclusion of Shiva. But while Shiva may fade into the background as the theoretical substrate of the power embodied in the goddess, he never completely disappears, even in the most radically Shakta of texts within this Kashmirian tradition, and there are some which are rather radically Shakta, which, for example, define the goddess as that point within Shiva's nature which Shiva himself cannot be aware of, the point of his absolute spontaneous being, which he cannot get behind to observe. That brings us pretty close to the idea of the goddess as the ultimate ground of the ground, but nonetheless, theoretically, it's still Shiva Shakti, the power of the goddess. This, of course, raises the possibility that a Shaktism could also be Vaishnava as well as Shaiva. And indeed, I think it was, to a large extent, in certain periods of Indian history. That period has been largely overlaid by the work of the Shaiva redactors. But if you look at a work like the Jayadratayamala, a vast compendium of nearly 24,000 verses, looking at many different forms of the goddess Kala Sankarshini or Kali, one finds therein a number of kalpas or ritual procedures in which the goddess has very many strongly Vaishnava characteristics. So she is, for example, the consort of Narasingha. So indeed, I think it's reasonable to make this assertion that certain forms of radical Shaktism that we see in the Kashmirian tradition go back to more Vaishnava-inflected prototypes. I shan't pursue that theme here, but I am pursuing it in current work that I am doing, and showing indeed that this esoteric Kali tradition has, at an early phase in its development, colonized what looked like more wild forms of Vaishnava worship. Now, I'm going to begin by contextualizing. And of course, contextualizing could be to reproduce the whole of my work, my life's work, because that's been about contextualizing the Shaiva tradition of Kashmir, the Shakta Shaiva tradition of Kashmir. But I'm a great believer in contextualization. I think the meaning of things comes from the understanding of their context. And so I'm going to begin by giving you an outline of the historical picture as I see it, within which the Kashmirian contributions can be located. Now, I have prepared for this lecture a substantial handout, which will contain a lot more detail than I can possibly give now in the course of an hour's lecture. And that will be made available to those attending this lecture. It'll be distributed shortly, I believe. Now, any attempt to date Shaivism, to give a horizon after which it must have been present, is fraught with difficulty, if only because one's likely to tread on a lot of toes when one points out that much of the evidence adduced to claim its vast antiquity is actually insubstantial or highly doubtful. So I'm going to begin, I'm afraid, by rejecting 4 theories which still seem to be standing, at least for some people. And I'm afraid that there's no other way around this. We simply have to eliminate these theories in order to get a clearer understanding of the historical picture. Now, the first of these theories is the claim that the figure with a horned headdress seated in a yogic posture, I put inverted commas around yogic because it's assumed to be yogic. In fact, it's a person or creature sitting in a cross-legged posture. So this figure with a horned headdress seated in a yogic posture and allegedly 3-faced and ichthyphallic, that is to say with an erect penis, which is depicted on a steatite seal, number 420, unearthed at Mohenjo-Daro from the Indus Valley civilization, that is to say from the period approximately 2600 BC to 1900 BC, the claim that this is recognizable at once as the prototype of the historical Shiva. So this has often been adduced as evidence that Shaivism goes right back to pre-Vedic times, if you believe in pre-Vedic times. Many people don't, it seems. That this tradition of Shiva worship goes right back to this very early level in the historical record of the subcontinent. However, a sober analysis of this figure in the light of other seals has shown that the supposed erect penis is in fact the end of the waistband, and that the supposed 2 lateral faces are rather the ears of a bull-headed figure. The affinities of this and other bull-man, horn-crowned Indus Valley icons are to be found not in post-Vedic India, but in the trans-Elamite culture of southeastern Iran and western Baluchistan that developed from the Mesopotamian early dynastic period to Ur 3 times, that is to say, from about 2900 BC to 1940 BC. The second theory that I reject is that when the Rig Veda deprecates the so-called Shishna Deva, literally those whose god is the penis, it is referring to worshippers of the linga, the phallic substrate of Shiva's worship, and therefore provides evidence that Shaivism was current in the subcontinent more than 1500 years before the Common Era. In 7.21.5 of the Rig Veda, the poet prays that these persons whose god is the penis will not attack our truth. And in another hymn, 10.99, we are told that Indru slew them. In my view, the meaning intended is more probably those whose highest object of veneration is their own sex organs, alleging godless carnality rather than Shaiva religious practice. I think here of the classical Sanskrit expression Shishnodara Parayana, which we see in the Mahabharata, meaning intent above all on satisfying penis and belly. But even if the expression does refer to real rather than figurative worship, and even if there were a historical link between this penis worship deprecated in the Rig Veda and the much later Shaiva worship of the linga, it would not follow that this ancient antecedent was in any meaningful sense Shaiva. The third view is that the third claim is the view that Shiva is the identity of the Indian Dionysus of the Greek author Megasthenes, that is to say, the Indian deity identified by Megasthenes as Dionysus. Megasthenes, according to his own testimony, visited India in an embassy sent to Chandragupta Maurya, who ruled circa 321 to 297 BC, and wrote about the country and its people, drawing on the interpretations of other Greeks in a lost work known to us in part through the testimony of later historians from the 1st century BC to the 2nd century AD. According to the fragments of this work reported by these authors, Megasthenes associated his Indian Dionysus with wine and bacchanalian rites, and this has prompted the conclusion that he must have had Shiva in mind, since Shiva was believed to have a similarly orgiastic nature. but that belief was derived from much later and inapposite Shakta Shaiva sources. If any Indian god was associated at this time with wine drinking and drunken revels, it was Baladeva, otherwise known as Balarama or Sankarshana, the older brother of the god Vasudeva or Krishna, who has been thought to be the Indian Heracles, the only other Indian cult figure mentioned by Megasthenes. You may be surprised that Megasthenes should single out these two Greek figures, Dionysus and Heracles, for his Interpretatio Graeca of Indian religion. The explanation for this lies in the fact that Megasthenes was drawing on the reports of those who had accompanied Alexander in his invasion of India in 327 BC, and were seeking to magnify their heroic leader. For Alexander believed that Heracles and Dionysus were his forefathers, that they had penetrated Asia as far as India before him, and that he was simply following their example, even surpassing it. The fourth position that I reject is the claim based on conjectural emendations and ancillary arguments that there is knowledge of Shaivism, indeed of the Shakta Shaiva cult of the goddess Kali, in the Pali Buddhist canon. If this claim is sound, then worship of Shiva was already current in some form as early as the 4th century BC. The evidence adduced, however, has not survived scrutiny. Now, although there may be no evidence of knowledge of Shaivism in the Pali canon, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And there is no evidence of which I am aware that excludes the possibility that the worship of Shiva was present somewhere in the Indian subcontinent during this early period. It may well have been there. However, we may be confident that if such worship was present, it was not important enough to merit attention in the earliest Buddhist literature. Particularly significant is the silence of the Pali text Mahanidesa. For that text, perhaps composed as early as AD 300, catalogues the observances adopted by non-Buddhist votaries to propitiate gods. The gods listed, or is an exhaustive list, it seems. The gods listed begin with Vasudeva and Baladeva, and the two Yaksha generals Purnabhadra and Manibhadra. I won't give you the complete list. Now, this evidence is particularly striking because it reports the propitiation of the Bhagavata deities Vasudeva and Baladeva. Indeed, it places their cults at the head of its list of deity observances. If Shiva had been known at this early period as a deity with a significant following, then we would expect that they would have been mentioned here at least. Their absence strongly suggests that this other tradition, which would rival and overshadow Vaishnavism in later centuries, had not yet emerged with any strength, if at all. What then is our earliest sure evidence of the worship of Shiva in India? It is to be found in the work of the great Indian grammarian Patanjali. His date, I'm afraid, is still subject to discussion, but the general consensus, which may not be the final one, places him around the middle of the 2nd century BC. He mentions Shiva and devotees of Shiva incidentally when commenting on 3 rules in Panini's grammar. In the first, 5.3.99, he mentions images of Shiva. In his comment on 5.2.76, he refers to devotees of Shiva, whom he calls Shiva Bhagavatas, those whose Bhagavan, whose deity is Shiva, and noting that they carry pikes, possibly even tridents. And in his comment on 6.3.26, we have a rule which tells us that when we want to make a dual compound of the deity names Shiva and Vaishravana, we do not lengthen the of Shiva. So we get Shiva Vaishravanao. This is an exception to the general rule that Vedic deity pairs show such lengthening of the final vowel of the first member. This pairing of Shiva and Vaishravana, Vaishravana being another name for Kubera, the god of wealth, is also seen in other early Indian sources. It's found in the Jaina Angavidya, a work on prognostication. It's found in that famous work on politics, the Arthashastra of Kartalya, and it's also seen in the Mahabharata. So this is the earliest literary evidence, which we can locate in the 2nd century BC with some hesitation. The earliest epigraphic evidence is as follows. By epigraphic evidence, I mean evidence recorded in dated inscriptions, which refer to donations to Shaiva foundations or the founding of Shaiva foundations. The oldest inscription I've encountered so far has a date of AD 75. Again, that date is somewhat provisional, but it's not far out. This is an inscription in a northwestern Prakrit found in the Pakhtunkhwa province of Pakistan. And it records that a certain Moika, son of Urumuja, the names are Iranian rather than Indian, had a Shiva stalam made here, that is to say, a precinct for the worship of Shiva. After that, we have a fragmentary record in a central western Prakrit at Vasana in the Dharwar district of Karnataka. And this reports a donation to a temple of Chanda Shiva Mahadeva, Mahadeva being a name of Shiva, which was established during the time of the Satavahana king Vasiti Putta Siri, that's to say in Sanskrit, Vasishti Putra Shri Pulamavi II, whose reign spanned the turn of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. So very little epigraphic evidence at this early period. That the worship of Shiva was a relatively late phenomenon in the Deccan, or at least late in its recognition by the Satavahana kings, is suggested by the formula of obeisance that opens the Prakrit inscription of Nayanika, consort of the early Satavahana king Satakani I, at the top of the Nane Ghat pass in the Western Ghats. For in the proemium of this record, which was written in the 2nd half of the 1st century AD, obeisance is offered only to Prajapati, Dharma, Indra, Sankarshana and Vasudeva, Chandra and Surya, the 4 Lokapalas, Indra and Skanda. This list is strikingly similar to the list which I did not give you in its totality, whose votaries' practices are attacked in the Buddhist Mahanidesa. There is no mention here of Shiva under this or any other name. After the Vasana record, I know of no epigraphic evidence of any other Shaiva foundation of which we can be sure that it predates the 4th century AD. From that time onwards, however, epigraphic and literary evidence is abundant. There is also a supposed numismatic evidence, evidence from coins, from the legends and images on coins. And if this interpretation as Shaiva evidence were genuine, this would greatly raise the profile of Shaivism during the 2nd century BC up to the 4th century AD, that is to say, between the Mauryas and the Guptas. For it has been maintained that we have abundant proof of recognition of the importance of Shaivism from as early as the late 2nd century BC on coin issues of the foreigners who ruled parts of northern India during this period, namely the Indo-Greeks, the Indo-Scythians, the Indo-Parthians, and the Kushans. Now, I've set out the detail of all that in your handout, and I won't go into it in any great detail. I'll dismiss the major part of that evidence by saying that there's no evidence at all that the item said to be Shaiva, namely the depiction of a bull, there's no evidence at all that that image conclusively proves a Shaiva connection. Bulls were already being used by the Seleucids a long way away from India in the 3rd century BC. And generally, the supposed Indian element occurs on coins whose, on the reverse of which we see purely Greek deities. So to jump to the conclusion that this is Shiva's bull seems to be rash. There's also claims that a figure carrying a trident on some coins of Mauis and Gondophares, the Indo-Parthians, that these are Shiva. I think it's much more likely that the deity being represented is the Greek god Poseidon, in keeping with the other deities on the coins of these rulers, all of whom are Greek. More contentious, however, is evidence that from the beginning of the 2nd century AD to the early 4th century, Shiva appears on the reverse of several of the coin issues of the Kushans, beginning from the reign of Vima II Kadphises of about AD 95 to 127, and ending with that of Basadeo or Vasudeva II in the late 3rd to early 4th century. The deity is certainly rather Shiva-like. It is 2, 4, or 6 armed, sometimes 3-faced, sometimes accompanied by a bull, sometimes with an erect penis, and holds a trident. It has been assumed from the similarity with the iconography of Shiva in later times that this shows that the Kushans had adopted Shiva as one of their tutelary deities, adding him to their non-Indian and predominantly Iranian pantheon. But against this striking iconic similarity must be set the fact that the deity is identified in the modified Greek script used for the Bactrian legends on these coins as Wesho, which was probably pronounced Wesh. But this is an East Iranian wind god who surfaces later in Sogdian Buddhist sources of the 7th and 9th centuries as the 3-faced deity Wesh Parkar, seen in pictorial representations found in mural paintings of the early 8th century, excavated various places in Central Asia. That this is a wind god follows from recognition that the name Wesh Parkar is a Middle Iranian descendant of Avestin Vayush Uparokairyo, the name of the wind god in the nominative singular followed by an epithet Uparokairya, a combination that occurs several times in the scriptural corpus of the Zoroastrians, both in that of the priestly liturgy and in that of the prayers to be recited by the faithful on everyday occasions. The striking iconographic similarity between Wesh and Shiva remains to be explained, but the assumption that this must be understood as the result of the absorption by Wesh of features proper to an already canonized iconography of Shiva is unjustified. I favor the alternative hypothesis that Wesh contributed to the evolution of that iconography, as occurred with 3 other major deities of the Kushans' pantheon: Ardoksho, in the case of the Indian goddesses Hariti and Lakshmi, Nana, in that of Durga, and Shroshard, in that of Skanda. It is apparent then that firm evidence of Shaivism during the centuries between Patanjali and the Guptas is so sparse that one might be tempted to conclude that at this time devotion to Shiva was a marginal phenomenon in comparison with Buddhism, Jainism, and Vaishnavism. We certainly have far less epigraphic evidence of its patronage during this period. However, the epigraphic record also reveals that although Shaivism was not a major beneficiary of royal support at this early period, it was nonetheless widespread in the population, and that this was the case throughout the subcontinent. We can infer this from the fact that theophoric names, names beginning with Shiva and meaning, for example, given by Shiva, servant of Shiva, or protected by Shiva, are well represented from the 2nd century BC up to the 3rd century AD among the many lay donors named in the Buddhist and Jaina donative inscriptions of that period, found throughout the subcontinent from Afghanistan down to Amaravati in Andhra Pradesh. This is also the period during which the anthropomorphic iconography of Shiva began to take shape, and the linga, Shiva's phallic emblem, and the principal substrate of worship, emerges in the archaeological record and passes through the greater part of the changes in design that led to its classical, less naturalistic form. From this evidence, I conclude that when Shaivism did rise to prominence in the epigraphic record, as it did in later centuries, it did so on the basis of an already well-established and widespread tradition of popular devotion that goes back at least to the 2nd century BC. Evidence of the gradual rise of Shaivism to significance on the pan-Indian scene is also to be found in Buddhist notices of it. Although awareness of the existence of votaries of Shiva is lacking in the Pali canon, it does appear in later works, as the cult of Shiva became more prominent. In the Vinaya, that is to say, the work dealing with monastic discipline of the Dharmaguptakas, which was composed in Gandhara in the far northwest around the beginning of the Christian era, we encounter Maheshwara introduced into a series of deities whom a certain king is said to have worshipped successfully in order to obtain offspring. It's a list rather similar to that in the Mahanidesa, but with the addition of Maheshwara. Purna Bhadra, Mani Bhadra, the sun, the moon, Indra, Brahma, Prithvi, Agni, Vayu, Maheshwara, and then various local deities, gods of gardens, woods, the wilderness and markets, Hariti, and the gods of walled towns. He also appears in the same context, but now under the name Shiva, and at the head of the list in the Chivaravastu section of the Vinaya of the Mula Sarvastivadins, not produced before the reign of Kushan-Kanishka, the Kushan Emperor Kanishka I, who ruled by common consensus between AD 127 and 147 AD. It was probably produced during that reign, in fact. And this reference occurs in a passage concerning a certain householder of the city of Shravasti. And translated, it reads as follows: being without a son and desiring a son, he prays to Shiva, to Varuna, Kubera, Indra, Brahma, and other deities who are specific to particular places, namely deities of gardens, woods, squares, crossroads, also deities that receive bali offerings, deities that are of his lineage, of his religion, and permanently attached to him. Also, Maheshwara begins to appear in the literature of Mahayana Buddhism as an interlocutor in scriptural dialogues. He appears in this role in the early version of the Lalita Vistara, which was translated into Chinese in AD 308, and in that of the Saddharma Pundarika, translated in AD 286. However, at this early stage, there is as yet no sign of Buddhist defensive hostility to Shaivism, nothing that would suggest that Shaivism had already achieved the status of a significant rival for patronage. The earliest knowledge of such hostility appears, to my knowledge, in the Mahayanist Ratnaketu Parivarta of the Mahasanipata Sutra collection, also known as the Ratnaketu Dharani Sutra, which was first translated into Chinese during the first quarter of the 5th century. There, the wicked Mara, the tempter of the Buddha, appears before him in the form of Shiva and tries in vain to lure him and his followers from the Buddhist path by offering to teach him his own true path to liberation. The episode is present not only in the Gilgit manuscript of the Sanskrit text, probably of the 7th century AD, but also in the 2 Chinese translations, the first completed by Dharmakshema between 416 and 426 AD. Here we see the beginning of the response to the rise of Shaivism that would culminate in the 8th century and afterwards in the Buddhist mythology and iconography of the violent subjection and conversion of the Shaiva deities, which we see in the Buddhist Yoga Tantras and Yogini Tantras. As for evidence of Shaivism's rise to dominance after the Gupta period, the first signs of which we see in this Ratnaketu Parivarta, the evidence is really overwhelming. It's archaeological and epigraphical and also textual. Firstly, there's a great preponderance in quantity and quality of Shaiva temples over all others during this period. Suddenly, Shaiva temple building really takes off. And many of the great creations of early medieval Indian architecture, the great majority of them, are indeed Shaiva. There's also an overwhelming preponderance of Shaiva foundations recorded in inscriptions for this period. Finally, we have the evidence of the powerful influence exerted on surrounding traditions leading by Shaivism, leading to the creation of Vajrayana Buddhism, what I'm calling here Neo-Pancharatra, that is to say, the later Pancharatra texts found in such tantric works as the Jayaki Samhita, the Sarpita Samhita, and the Paushkara Samhita, which seem to me to be so similar in their technology and their ritual system to the Shaiva ones, that we need to assume that these are in fact the result of a substantial retooling by certain Pancharatrika groups of their ritual system along Shaiva lines. And we also have the evidence of such transformation or retooling of a ritual system in the case of the Jainas. As I've pointed out on another occasion, the Jaina liturgical system of the Nirvana Kalika, which deals with initiation and also the installation of temples and images. I've pointed out that this text, the Nirvana Kalika, was redacted on the basis of the 11th century Saiddhāntika Shaiva manual Siddhanta Sara Padati of Bojadeva with very little change. Elimination of bits that couldn't be used and simple modifications of the Sanskrit where necessary, often simply crossing out Shiva and putting in Jinna, for example. There is also a large body of Jaina Mantra Shastra texts, such as the Bhairava Padmavati Kalpa and the Jvala Amalini Kalpa, which are strongly calqued on the late Shakta Shaiva tradition of Tripura Sundari worship. And also there's the Yoga Shastra of Hemachandra, which, though is a comprehensive treatment of the Jain path according to Shvetambaras, although it is a thoroughly Jaina work, contains a lot of reprocessed Shaiva material, which fundamentally, in my view, changes the character of the Jaina religion. Now we come finally, after that initial survey of the history of Shaivism, when it begins to emerge and evidence of its rise to dominance, we come now to consider the forms of Shaivism within which we have to locate the Shakta systems of Kashmir. The first dichotomy we need to be aware of is that between lay Shaivism and initiatory Shaivism. Now this distinction is one between those who are devotees of Shiva, including ascetics, as well as householders, but they have not undergone an initiatory process such as characterizes the initiatory systems of the Shaivas, of tantric Shaivism and other such systems. So this lay Shaivism is a rather loose and fluid category, which is found in a large array of texts. There's a core of such works, the Shiva Dharma and the Shiva Dharmottara, and then there are many Puranic works which contain similar material. So these are forms of worship of Shiva which can be undertaken within the context of Brahmanical religion without incurring the accusation of having abandoned faith in the Vedic tradition. If you take Shaiva initiation, then that is a problem from the point of view of the ultra-Orthodox. You have stepped out of the domain of Veda-rooted authority into forms of parshandam, forms of practice which are not authorized by the Vedic corpus. So lay Shaivism on the whole is congruent with the Veda, and initiatory Shaivism, at least in the eyes of the ultra-Orthodox, authors such as Bhatta Kumarila, is un-Vedic, outside the Veda, Veda Bahya. And some forms of Shaivism, the more antinomian, are considered to be Veda Bahyatara, even further outside the Veda than such religions as Buddhism and Jainism, because of their transgressive antinomian character. Now, initiatory Shaivism. This is a vast area. The literature was once so vast that I'm sure I could never have read it in my lifetime. Fortunately, one shouldn't really say this, but it is at least now feasible to read this literature, if not in its entirety, at least in the majority, because much has been lost in the course of the centuries. The texts that we have refer to many others, which we no longer have. So, looking at this vast literature, I see three essential traditions. Now, I'm talking now as if I'm describing the periodic table. We have these three completely independent entities. Actually, of course, they are the result of historical evolution. They are undergoing change. There's no absolute boundary between them. These boundaries, in any case, are constantly being renegotiated. But nonetheless, the learned within the later systems saw a fundamental dichotomy between themselves and what went before them. And they expressed this in terms of a distinction between what they called the atimārga and the mantramārga. The atimārga here refers to a number of ascetic-only traditions of a rather austere, world-transcending kind. And these were seen as in opposition to, in contrast with the mantramārga, a system we might roughly call tantric, which was open not only to ascetics, but also to householders, and which promised liberation by virtue of ritual, essentially by virtue of ritual, the ritual of initiation. Of course, those competent to take on ritual duties after initiation were obliged to do so, but there were others, notably kings, who are granted the benefit of initiation, i.e. the promise of liberation at death, without the inconvenience of ritual duties thereafter. So essentially what characterizes this system is that it's a highly ritualistic one, which claims to be engaging mantras, gestures, offerings into fire and the like, which have the supernatural effect of eliminating the bondage of the soul. So atimārga and mantramārga, and there's a third element which is not clearly distinguished in my earlier writing, and that is the kulamārga, the path of the Kaula or Shakta traditions. Now the boundary between the mantramārga and the kulamārga is not entirely clear because the Shaktization which characterizes the kulamārga also affects parts of the mantramārga. It's like two rivers flowing together and for a while blurring into each other. So this boundary between mantramārga and kulamārga is not entirely clear, as we will see. Now the atimārga, I have distinguished 3 stages of the atimārga, which I have named atimārga 1, atimārga 2, and atimārga 3. Atimārga 1, it's a chronological order. Atimārga 1 is the system of the Pashupata Sutras, otherwise called the Pancharta Sutra, and its commentary by Kaundinya. There are also some other texts, the Ganakarika and its commentary, the Ratnatika, and some minor tracts on matters such as initiation and penance. The earliest epigraphic evidence of the Pashupata tradition, also known as the Panchartika, because they are following the Pancharta Shastra, the earliest evidence is dated to the early 4th century, and this is epigraphic evidence, and it points to the existence of this tradition perhaps as early as the 2nd century AD. This system is accessible only to invested Brahmin men, that's to say Brahmin males who have undergone the Upanayana ceremony, which entitles them to recite the mantras of the Veda. So in a sense, it's a kind of Veda transcending practice within the domain of Vedic observance, and was seen as therefore seen in Orthodox circles as a somewhat ambiguous tradition, half in and half out. It's characterized by some very extraordinary behavior, namely the idea that one must remove oneself from the world by courting abuse from it, by behaving in a way, by appearing to behave in a way that deserves such abuse. The idea being that this would gradually distance oneself from mundane values and lead eventually to a state in which one could concentrate uninterruptedly in one's meditation on Shiva. Finally, when that meditation had been fully established, retreating to a cremation ground to die there through a yogic separation of the soul from the body, a kind of yogic suicide known as utkranti, rising from the body. In atimārga 2, this tradition was modified somewhat. It produced its own canon of scriptures, none of which have survived. We only have a list of their names and a single citation from one of them. But we also have a brief but informative account of the beliefs, or their beliefs, and also their world-rejecting antinomian practices. And this account is found in a group of mantramārga texts, which I call the Nishwasa corpus. These, in fact, are the earliest texts of the mantramārga, probably dating from the 5th to the 7th centuries AD. And this account is backed up by later Sri Vaishnava attacks in the works of Yamunacharya and Ramanuja. Now, what characterizes these sectaries, variously known as Lakulas, Kalamukas, and Mahavratas, is that their transgression of Brahmanical norms is made absolutely clear by the fact that they beg with a human skull as begging bowl and carry a staff topped by a human skull, as it were impersonating, not as it were, in fact impersonating those observing a penance ordained in Brahmanical Shastra for the killing of a Brahmin, the slaying of a Brahmin. And in doing this, they are mimicking, they are identifying with Rudra or Shiva in his role as Brahmin slayer, which we see in Shaiva mythology, since, as no doubt many of you know, Shiva is often represented as having curbed the arrogance of Brahma by removing his 5th head, leaving him with only 4. Hence, Shiva carries the skull of Brahman in his hand. The brief account of their practices given in the Nishwasa corpus indicates that they rejected Brahmanical notions of purity, allowing their devotees to eat their sectaries, that's to say those performing their ascetic practices, to abandon all dietary restrictions, eating and drinking whatever they wished. And this text also introduces the idea of a kind of initiation which looks as though it's already of a soteriological kind, that the very act of initiation is somehow an anticipation of final release, that somehow the soul is raised up through a cosmic hierarchy to achieve in advance a uniting with the ultimate goal of this tradition. Now, the Nishwasa corpus, which I've mentioned, inherits and extends the cosmos, this many-layered cosmos of the Lakulas, and gives us this distinction between the atimārga, in which it recognizes only atimārga 1 and atimārga 2, and the mantramārga, which it announces for the first time as its own system. So this distinction between the atimārga and mantramārga is articulated in the earliest mantramārgic material. How early is this material? Well, it predates the Nishwasa corpus, and so is probably earlier than the 5th century. There is abundant epigraphic evidence of it in later centuries, mostly from Maharashtra and Karnataka, where this particular tradition seems to have dominated the Shaiva temples there for some centuries. Now we come to atimārga 3, which is particularly relevant for this overview of the development of Shaktism within Shaivism. Now, atimārga 3 is the tradition of the Karpalikas, literally the skull bearers, who are followers of the Soma-saiddhāntika, and they're also called Mahavratins. So they too use a skull bowl for begging. They too carry a skull bowl. They too carry a staff with a skull attached to the top. But in that sense, they are continuers of the tradition of the Lakulas, atimārga 2. But what characterizes this, what's new about the atimārga 3, is that it is the site of the eruption of Shaktism into the atimārga. The previous two systems, atimārga 1 and atimārga 2, are purely focused on Rudra or Shiva. That distinction is not important in that context. There are no feminine elements whatsoever. It's a radically austere, male-only system of extreme asceticism. With the atimārga 2, we have grafted onto this antinomian cults of new deities, whom we know from inscriptions from fairly early on, but new deities, namely Bhairava, this ferocious form of the god. The word actually means the fearsome or the frightening. So seen by the theologians as identical with Shiva, but obviously different in origin. Bhairava and the emaciated goddess known variously as Chamunda or Charchika or Karnamurti. There are various names for her. But let us just say Chamunda, that's perhaps the best known term. Now, with the eruption of these antinomian cults of Bhairava and Chamunda, we find a very new kind of religion introduced, involving possession. The goal of these sectaries is to induce in themselves a state in which these deities take them over, possess them literally. We find also collective orgiastic worship. Collective worship is completely absent from anything preceding. In fact, it's rather rare in Indian religion in general. But here we have collective orgiastic worship, often caste promiscuous. And this modality of Indian religion, with its emphasis upon possession or avesha, with its emphasis on collective orgiastic worship, known as Chakrayaga or Murti Yaga, we see a form of religion that will flourish later in the mantramārga, in the division of that tradition known as the Vidyapita, and will also flourish in the kulamārga. In fact, the kulamārga can be seen as a kind of upgraded or updated version of atimārga 3. And I've put that one of the sections in my handout in bold to indicate the importance of this transition, the sudden eruption of ecstatic, orgiastic, possession-oriented cults of these furious deities, Bhairava and Chamunda, consumption of meat and wine, promiscuous sexual intercourse, and all sorts of ecstatic practices which are completely alien to anything that goes before, but became normalized in later times within certain divisions, more extreme divisions admittedly, of the mantramārga and the kulamārga. Now, there's no reference to this Kāpālika tradition of atimārga 3 before the 5th century. The earliest reference to Kāpālikas that I have encountered is in Agastya Singha's Prakrit commentary on the Jain Dasa Vayalaya Sutta, Gata 327, on followers of bad religious practices. This commentary can be dated to around the 5th century, but I think although it has been asserted that it can be dated realistically to the 5th century, I think this is now in doubt, because this depends upon the date of a certain council to standardize the Jain canon, the Shvetambara Jain canon, whose date has been called into question recently. So perhaps this is not entirely certain now. Nonetheless, after the 5th century, references to the Kāpālikas abound, beginning with the Brihat Samhita of Varahamihira in the first half of the 6th century, and also with the Vasavadatta, the prose poem Vasavadatta of the poet Subandhu, who lived in the second half of the 6th century. Now, it's been claimed, namely by Lawrenson, in his study of the Kālamukas and Kāpālikas from 1991, that we have a much earlier reference to the Kāpālikas from the early centuries of the Christian era in the Buddhist Lalita Vistara, since that mentions deluded ascetics who believe that they are purifying themselves by such practices as carrying a skull and a skull staff. It is indeed the case that this text goes back to that period, since the first of the 2 Chinese translations, that by Dharmaraksha, was completed in AD 308, according to the Kaiyuan Lu catalogue of AD 730, which later Chinese editors considered the most reliable. But a passage in the Chinese corresponding to the passage cited by Lawrenson, seen in the Sanskrit text edited on the basis of much later Nepalese manuscripts, is found only in the 2nd translation, completed by Divakara in AD 683 or 685. The section of the much earlier translation, roughly corresponding to that within which this reference occurs, includes no mention of such practices. Indeed, like the Pali Canon, it seems entirely unaware of Shaivism. For when in this section it lists the various gods in which those with false views place their trust, it does not include Maheshwara. It is only in Divakara's version that the repertoire of deities has expanded to accommodate him. There are other passages, there are other claims in Lawrenson's work to have found references to Kāpālikas in early works. In these cases too, the evidence is highly dubious. So I'm afraid we are left with our 6th century date. Epigraphic records from the 7th century are abound from the 7th century to the 12th. We have inscriptions from various parts of India, from Chhattisgarh to Gujarat, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, and Tamil Nadu. There are also numerous colorful literary accounts of Kāpālika practice. Obviously, it's good stuff for a dramatic story. And one of these, which I find particularly informative as a scholar of Shaivism, is the Malati Madhava of the great poet Baba Bhuti, which seems to me to be based upon a thoroughly well-versed acquaintance with the literary tradition of this system. Now, this atimārga 3 is not recognized as a variety of the atimārga in the Nishwasa corpus, but is recognized as such in later texts. Now, when we come to the mantramārga, what marks this, as I mentioned before, is initiation as the means of liberation and the accomplishing of supernatural effects, and it is open to both ascetics and the married. We distinguish here between saiddhāntika Shaivism and non-saiddhāntika Shaivism. The followers of the Saiddhāntika division of the mantramārga propagated a vision of a Shaiva Vedic social order under the authority of Shaiva kings, and cultivated a marked public dimension. Its leading ascetic acharyas served as the gurus of kings, offered them Shaiva initiation and consecration, consecrated royal temples, royal palaces, and public utilities such as irrigation works, and developed a monastic network, aspiring to pan-Indian liturgical standardization. In its observances, it avoided all antinomian elements and maintained conformity with Brahmanical caste divisions. It was strongly ritualistic in its orientation, a tendency consolidated and defended by its earliest known exegete Sadyojyotis of the period 675 to 750, in my opinion, and by his later Kashmirian followers Bhattanarayana Kanta and Bhattarama Kanta during the 10th and 11th centuries, and also by their South Indian epigones from the 12th century onwards. There's an extensive body of scripture under Saiddhāntika titles in South Indian manuscript collections also, but there's no trace of these works outside this region, and their content reflects a distinctive South Indian Shaiva tradition centered on the great temples of the Chola period. So we have in fact two Saiddhāntika scriptural corpora, one evidence mainly in Kashmir and in Nepalese manuscript collections, and the other represented exclusively by South Indian manuscripts. And this is really a quite separate body of texts. The earliest part of this tradition, the Saiddhāntika tradition, is, as I've already mentioned, the Nishwasa corpus, which was in its earliest part composed as early as the 5th century. As for epigraphic evidence, that takes us back to the 6th century. We also have epigraphic evidence of royal initiations, the giving of Saiddhāntika Shaiva initiation to monarchs from the second half of the 7th century onwards. And this, of course, marks the arrival of Shaivism at the highest level through winning patronage of important rulers in the region and persuading them to accept Shaiva initiation as a means of empowering their rule as well as legitimating it. When we come to the non-saiddhāntika mantramārga, we're dealing with scriptures that are often referred to as the Bhairava corpus, and this has been variously classified in our sources. These texts teach antinomian practice centering on the propitiation of the fierce deities Bhairava and the goddess, with a heavy orientation towards siddhis, the attainment of supernatural effects, that recommended it strongly to royal patrons, but also developing strongly mystical soteriologies based on the non-dualistic, or rather anti-dualistic, transcendence of Brahmanical notions of purity and caste. They were generally not engaged in the public domain. They teach private practice for oneself or for royal and other clients seeking supernatural protection and other such benefits through the commissioning of tantric rituals. Within this rather large corpus of texts, we need to distinguish in the first case between the Mantra Pita and the Vidya Pita. I should add this is just one of several classifications, but it is, I think, particularly revealing and corresponds very closely to the way the Kashmirian authors saw this branch of the Shaiva tradition. So we distinguish between a Bhairava-oriented Mantra Pita, literally a mantra collection, and the principal text there is the Swachanda Tantra, which teaches the worship of Swachanda Bhairava and his consort Agoreshwari. Then we have the Vidya Pita, which is closer to our Shakti traditions, and this is goddess-orientated, the term Vidya meaning a female mantra, if you like. And within this rather diverse category of texts, we have two that concern us in particular. Others are listed on your handout. The Shakti Tantras, and one, in fact, that we need to refer to principally here, the Shakti Tantras, which comprise two divisions that are relevant to us, the Trika and the Kali Kula. Both these are strongly influenced by the atimārga, and I think within the Kali Kula scriptural corpus, we actually have material surviving in there which have been very superficially redacted from atimārga 3 sources because they do not conform to the norm for that particular category. They seem archaic, less developed, less, one suddenly feels the ground slipping beneath falling away from beneath one's feet when one encounters these sections of the text. So although we don't have any atimārga 3 scriptural texts surviving, I think we have materials within the Vidyapita that give us access to those materials, thinly redacted atimārga 3 sources. Within that category, we have texts of the Trika, a system for the propitiation of a set of deities, Para, Para, Pran, Apara, also the alphabet goddesses Matrika and Baladi, taught in a number of texts, of which only a small amount survives. We have a short redaction of the Siddhi Yogeshwari Mata. We have the Mal Nivijyotra, assumed to have survived in totality, but in fact, I think not quite. The manuscripts all are lacunos at a certain crucial point. But at least we have majority of the text. Then we have a very important work which does appear to be lost, although we have many citations from it, the Trishra Bhairava. And we have another work which survives in early Nepalese manuscripts, the Tantra Sadbhava. And on top of those, we have quite a few works which are cited by Abhinavagupta or paraphrased by Abhinavagupta in the course of his exegesis of this tradition. Then we have the Kali Kula, which is represented by the Jayadratayamala, a vast text of some 24,000 verses teaching the worship of various forms of Kala Samkarshini. Now we come to the kulamārga, also heavily influenced from atimārga 3. We have in that category various purely Kala texts which teach the worship of the goddess Kuleshwari, surrounded by or accompanied by the 8 mother goddesses, beginning with Brahmani. And I've listed their titles, beginning with the Kula Panchashika and the Kaula Jnana Nirnaya. But then we also have kulamārga materials within texts of Shakti orientation that have been assigned to the mantramārga, so that in such traditions, we are offered 2 distinct cults of their deities, one following the mantramārga, sometimes called the tantra system, and the other, seen as more elevated, following the kulamārga, with its emphasis upon possession and collective orgiastic worship. In this category, the Mal-Nivijyotra stands out because it clearly distinguishes between a Tantra Prakriya and a Kula Prakriya, a Tantra system and a Kula system. And then we have within the Jayadratayamala a clear distinction between the first Shatka, which teaches a mantramārga tradition, and the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Shatkas, which were clearly added later and probably in Kashmir, which teach a Kaula system for the propitiation of the goddess Kali. Then we have a corpus of scriptures belonging to a system that calls itself the Krama or Maharta, the great teaching, the great truth, Krama, Maharta, sometimes Mahanaya also. We have the Kali Kula Panchashataka, the Kali Kula Krama Sadbhava, the Devi Dvyarda Shatika, the Yoni Gahra, and related materials redacted within the Jayadratayamala itself. Then we have scriptures of the worship of the goddess Kubjika. These are strongly Kala works, and these are heavily dependent on the scriptures of the Trika. Much scriptural material has simply been reprocessed and reused within the Kubjika Mata and other related texts. And finally, we have the literature of the cult of Tripura Sundari, an early text known as the Vamakeshwari Mata, and a later text, the Yogini Hridaya, which shows clear influence of the Kashmirian Shaiva non-dualist tradition of the 10th and 11th centuries, and so postdates that, and there's no doubt a South Indian creation. Now in Kashmir itself, which I arrived at too late, we're almost out of time, so perhaps I should at some point insert another lecture for you. We have virtually, we have the Saiddhāntika Shaivism, we also have non-saiddhāntika Shaivism of various forms, and I would like to go into that in some detail, and I see that I've run out of time here, and so perhaps I shall have to ask for another slot in order to accommodate this section of the lecture properly. Thank you very much.